I'm Beth Pariseau, Senior News Writer at TechTarget, and this is IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. Robert Slaughter is CEO of Defense Unicorns, a defense tech startup specializing in Airgap software delivery in highly secure and sensitive environments in the military and federal government. Previously, he was director of the U.S. Department of Defense's Platform One DevSecOps project and co-founder at Space Camp, a predecessor of Platform One for the U.S. Space Force. Prior to starting Defense Unicorns, he served 12 years in the U.S. Air Force. Welcome, Rob. Thanks for taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Beth.
So, this season I've talked to a few other security experts with experience in cyber defense and wondering what you see as the most pressing issue in that area right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. When I think about cyber attacks, what really comes to mind and what I immediately think about is what is the motive? And
Mm.
at the highest level, there's really two motives. So you have financial, and so
Hmm.
things like ransomware. If you look historically, I think you see massive increase of ransomware attacks, especially circa 2022,
Hmm.
2023. And then you have military effectiveness or
Mm.
potential nation to nation actions. When I think of what's going on in the community and what are people concerned with, it's really, in my opinion, that second one that's starting to become a lot more on people's minds. I know that there's been a number of congressional reports and announcements and kind of confirmation around other nations and what they're doing from an offensive cyber perspective. Whether it's looking at, and I don't even want to say attacking infrastructure, but
Mm.
almost more like preparing to potentially attack
Yeah.
infrastructure. And
Hmm.
so I know, one of your last guests was talking specifically about Salt Typhoon,
Yep.
some of the stuff that's going on with China. I think to me, that's one of the biggest trends is just larger businesses and companies that normally would not be as concerned with these type of things. They're probably more concerned for the rogue ransomware attacks. Now
Mm.
starting to be concerned on, well, what is China or Russia thinking? Are they actually targeting my business? Obviously, telecommunications is right up on the
Yeah.
list, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest critical infrastructure, supply chains. I really don't know that there's many businesses in the US that shouldn't be concerned with this. And I think people are
Mm.
starting to wake up and realize that.
Yeah. I talked to a private sector company this season that actually they caught him pretty quickly, but they ended up hiring a North Korean imposter.
Wow.
And that person probably wasn't there to exfiltrate data. He was there to make money and actually do the job. But still, there's not really a very bright line between the critical infrastructure of commerce and
Yep.
of the physical world as well, with everything gone digital. So, what's your outlook? What do we do about those issues?
It's really hard for me not to think about it from a military perspective, just because that's
Sure.
my background. What comes to mind from my perspective is there's a former Air Force vet, Colonel John Warden, that came up with Warden's Five Rings. And it's really
Mm.
about these centers of gravity of
Mm.
what any nation needs to protect against in terms of sustaining military operations. And so it starts on the outside with your fielded military, and then it moves inside to the population, gets a little closer towards the infrastructure, a little bit closer to the center towards system essentials, the essential things you need for operations, and then you get to leadership. I think the average company, average person, recognizing that they themselves are actually part of that structure and that population is an internal ring. Meaning,
Mm-hmm.
specifically, when the US conducts operations and looks at how do we disrupt an adversary, we're looking through that same lens of strategy and we're saying you might not be dropping a bomb on the population because there would be political ramifications for things like that. But it doesn't mean that you're not disrupting the water supply. It doesn't mean that critical infrastructure you're not sabotaging. And so I think people need to be viewing things through that lens. And I think one of the concepts to tie it back into the ransomware side of things is
Mm.
if your system is compromised and it's for a financial benefit, there's an urgency around the need. So it's like your system is compromised. How do you know that your system is compromised? Someone's
Mm.
going to tell you because somebody has a financial incentive to tell you. They don't want you to not be compromised. So they're going to tell you that it's compromised and then they're going to hold some ransom over your head. On
Mm.
the nation state side, there may not be an urgency around the compromise, the fact that it's compromised. So you actually have to actively interrogate the system. You have to
Mm.
actually actively look for these things. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's what needs to fundamentally change is that this concept of sustained interrogation of your system to detect cyber threats, it
Mm,
goes beyond pen testing, because pen
mm,
testing is existing vulnerabilities. If we were to get compromised, where is the system compromised? I think the majority of businesses need to learn a thing or two from the military side, which is
mm,
how do you actually have cyber units whose job it is not just detect where you might be compromised, but kind of start with the question that, hey, I think we are compromised. How do I detect that? How do I neutralize that? And so I think certain businesses certainly think this way. It's not like it's unique only to the military. But on the
mm.
military side, I think it's much more common to think that there's actually adversaries in your systems.
Right. It also does come down to a kind of organizational orientation, being proactive rather than reactive, in other words.
Yep.
And I don't know how most mainstream enterprises really get there. It seems like the cyber attacks just keep getting bigger and more costly every year. And I don't know, do you see a light at the end of that tunnel?
In the near term, I don't think there is. I think the number of cyber bullets that are going to be shot is going to substantially increase. And I
Mm.
think things like generative AI are accelerating those. Generative AI in its current form, I think, is an enabler, it's an accelerant, but it's not
Ah.
yet up to the sophistication that agents are conducting sophisticated attacks without a substantial amount of supervision. But I do
Mm.
think it's lowering the barrier to entry and accelerating a
Mm.
unit's or a team's ability to produce an effective cyber weapon to the other side. And so, as that barrier to entry reduces, the effects are the same. The impact of a cyber attack hasn't changed. It's still a substantial impact, whether it's financial
Mm.
or military. It's still this massive impact, but the barrier to entry has now gotten lower. And so I think common sense would dictate that, at least in the short term, things are going to get worse before they get better. I do think I have strong opinions around how things get better, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Okay. Would you say that generative AI is more useful to attackers than defenders at this point? Is that what you mean?
No, I think it's equally immature in many
Mm.
cases around both. If you think about 2024 from a cyber perspective, I think people are asking, how do I use this amazing tool for my mission, whether that's offensive
Mm.
or defensive cyber? And I think people are using it to get the 30, 40, 50% increase in effectiveness, mostly through, I think, productivity. A lot of the engineers at Defense Unicorns, they're using any AI tool they can get their hands on. We are seeing a productivity increase because people are starting to use these tools. But what it really does is it makes a great engineer even better. And
Hmm.
so on the cyber side, defensive and offensive, it's making an already great tool a little better, or it's making an already great engineer a little better, kind of on both sides. But that's more of a transformation than a disruption. The disruption comes when you can actually produce agents. And I think offensive cyber has the advantage there because, as I know you're well aware of,
Hmm.
cyber defense can be very depressing because you got to basically be perfect. It's
Yeah.
impossible to be. But the offensive side can take as many shots on goal as they want. You
Right.
got to defend all of them
Hmm.
because even one gets through, you can be compromised. And so, if you think about it in terms of volume, if cyber defense increases at the same rate as offensive systems, it's still going to be a losing proposition for the defensive side.
Right. I feel like I've been asking this question, even though my beat's not squarely in cybersecurity. What's it going to take? Is it going to take something really catastrophic to get people motivated? How do you think things might improve?
I really hope it doesn't take that. But a lot
Yeah.
of times, the United States in particular kind of waits for that catastrophic event to really rally around things. So you got
Mm.
Pearl Harbor, you have 9/11 as really tragic yet good examples of providing these massive catastrophic events that unite the country. And with that common
Hmm.
focus, we really make progress and really change things. I hope there is not the cyber equivalent to that. I think everybody hopes there is not the cyber equivalent to that. And I do
Right.
see changes happening. And I think it's
Mm.
really a question of, are the changes that are happening going to move fast enough to prevent what may be an inevitable catastrophic event in the future?
Mm. What do you think? How does that happen? What's the best case scenario?
I think it can. I think we got a lot of great leadership engaged, I think internal and external to the government. The government, I think, has great industry partners. Having been involved with the Department of Defense for the last 15 years, it's like night and day difference, even
Mm.
just between now and the last 5 years. So I see the progress. And so I would say that I hope so. I do
Hmm.
think that there's a number of things that the defense community, although very flawed in their approaches to modern cybersecurity practices, do have like one or two good things that I think have ultimately protected those systems. And I think commercial starting to adopt some of those practices, I don't even want to call them best practices, but
Mm.
most effective practices, I think we're going to see a little bit more of that.
What are some of those practices? What are some of the takeaways that mainstream enterprises can apply?
For us, the number one thing is actually having a disconnected or semi disconnected environment,
Mm.
specifically Airgap systems. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of defense systems that on the surface are actually quite insecure.
Huh.
If you actually look at what they're running, it's a lot of outdated software. What ultimately protects those systems is that moat,
Ah.
is that air gapped environment. And to clarify on the definition of air gap, or at least my definition of air gap, it's disconnected, semi disconnected, or extremely high firewall to where the employees might have access to do simple Google searches, but they're not going to have access to download anything. It's really this by exception connectivity. Those type of environments, to use the physical security equivalent to it, if a firewall is your wall of your castle, then that air gap is your moat. And I think
Mm-hmm.
people have underutilized that moat and they
Mm.
don't realize how effective it can be. Now, of course, businesses would struggle to adopt that because it's very difficult to manage your gapped environments. And
Yeah.
nobody knows that better than us, but it is very complex. And that complexity, I think, makes it so people aren't interested in it. They're like, wow, this user experience is difficult. It's
Mm.
so difficult to do these 10 or 20 things. And so, in our opinion, my opinion, as the user experience of air gapped environments improves and as that barrier to entry decreases, the hope would be that that's going at the same rate that your offensive AI capabilities are increasing. So that way,
Mm.
those critical systems can more easily manage a semi disconnected environment. That those small businesses that they may not have a cyber team equipped to handle these responses can just say, hey, these couple stores, we're going to connect to the stores themselves. And then, other than that, they're not going to connect to much else. And we're going to
Mm.
manage this semi disconnected environment. I think they're going to find that they're a lot safer than they were under how I think most people operate today.
Yeah, that time honored conflict between security and user experience or security and accessibility. Do you think any of the work that's been done around software supply chain security will be helpful at all? Do you think anything has substantially progressed in that area?
I think they have from a policy perspective, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm still very concerned around the implementation, specifically for SBOMs. It's a noble cause, it's the right approach, it's the right way to think about it. But then when you actually get drilled down to actually managing your SBOM systems to
Mm.
systems, you see a lot of logistical challenges. And
Hmm.
so I still think that the community needs to better derive and understand standards. I think there needs to be additional technology built around user experience. I do think that there's been progress, and I do think that it's a major aspect of security for our own systems that we manage. Everything that we work with has an SBOM. But
Mm-hmm.
how an SBOM is produced, software artifact to software artifact, is kind of unique and different. And it's not
Mm.
as if just including the SBOM is going to catch everything because they're not entirely inclusive of everything that's going on within the system. They're effectively
Mm.
incomplete records. And so the fact that there is not this completeness does make it different. In our case, we do pretty well because the systems we work with are air gaps. So you do have to actually package and manage everything. But I think a lot of systems, they don't really actually realize all of their software dependencies. So what they think the SBOM is and what the actual SBOM actually is are many times different things. And
Mm.
even if they accurately capture the SBOM, there's no guarantee that it's actually getting reported the right way.
Right. So, what's the biggest security operations story you've followed this year? Is it the AI stuff?
I think it's a combination of the AI stuff, not to mention some of the stuff going on specifically with Typhoon in China.
Mm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think the combination of those two are probably the biggest stories. Seeing the sophistication, especially at the unclassified level of Salt Typhoon and Flax
Mm.
Typhoon and Volt Typhoon and some of
Mm.
these other supposedly Chinese groups that are well organized, well equipped, seemingly well funded, actually going
Mm.
after groups and people that traditionally I don't think has been as targeted, or if they have, it's been not reported or less reported at least. Like I said, it's not eye-opening to me because I've spent my life in defense, but I suspect and believe it's eye-opening to a lot of people. The sophistication of the attacks and the fact that they're actually targeting some of these systems that are actually quite scary. Like, great examples on your last podcast. A gentleman talked about how a hospital can operate without power for days, but they can only operate without water for about 4 hours.
Yeah.
And so if you go back to Warden's five rings, if you actually
Mm.
wanted to disrupt our ability to care for the population, you could
Hmm.
just simply attack the water supply. And you're not only messing with what you would assume is the drinking water, you're actually disrupting the entire hospital. And you're probably
Right.
disrupting the base that's close by. Those one or two targets that you would normally not consider to be part of this military defense system is actually quite related.
And he was talking about how, if all else fails in terms of ways to shore up local water facilities and the like, that they go analog, that they unplug, that they introduce an air gap, like you're talking about. But he also told me he feels strongly that there hasn't been enough transparency from software vendors around what's in their software that they're selling to these critical infrastructure entities. What's been your experience around that?
I think it's hard.
Mm,
I think it goes back to what I was discussing and alluding to before is that
mm,
I think the reality is people don't know. They
mm,
don't, it's not like that they're just not being transparent. It's
mm,
that I don't think software vendors fully have a good grasp of everything going on. And
mm,
that if they actually try to report on their SBOM, if you actually drill down on most people, they're going to find that it's incomplete. And it's not even necessarily incomplete because of something they've done. It might be a dependency that they're using that I don't think fully captures what's going on. It's easy to say, hey, include an SBOM. But when you actually
mm-hmm.
get in the implementation details, I think what you find out is that it's a lot harder to be accurate in providing that SBOM than I think people realize.
Outside of cyber defense, the top topic that I've discussed with folks is Crowdstrike. Obviously, that was not a cyber attack, but it did bring home for some people how interconnected and interdependent digital systems are on each other in the modern economy, and how one domino falls and you end up with broadly scoped disruptions. Do you think that will be a learning experience? Do you think that might end up being a good wake up call in the long run?
I do, and I'm a huge fan of CrowdStrike, so I want to just lead with that before I say anything else. But I think it's a great example of over prioritizing in some cases the user experience around
Mm,
integrating a complex cybersecurity stack versus internally running it to make sure that your own dependencies or even external dependencies can be tested and you have control over that.
mm-hmm.
And so I think CrowdStrike provides an amazing user experience. Obviously, they've gotten to where they were because they're both effective and it's easy to use. But I think to relate it to defense systems, like a defense system would not want that dependency. They would not want
Right.
somebody else's update to somebody to press a button in it to bring down the system. And so,
Sure.
like, well, why don't people do that? Why don't people manage those systems themselves? It's because it's really hard and it's really complex.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, it goes back to what you were saying just a couple of minutes ago, which is you got to balance your cybersecurity expectations with the realities and requirements of the business or operations. And so it's this give and take between speed and velocity and user experience versus cybersecurity. And I think this is a good example of it was easy to onboard, easy to scale, but then you inadvertently created this situation to where an external provider could effectively take down your entire system because
Mm,
you didn't actually have control of how that third party system actually interacted with your own system. A lot of businesses wouldn't be able to afford managing something like that themselves. And without a doubt, that's why people don't do it. But even the people that could afford it or could do it, I think their concern legitimately would be the user experience around managing something as complex as that.
yeah, and it might take something major to shift those priorities, because I think a lot of, especially businesses, private sector companies, consumer companies, are really focused on staying connected with customers and offering services. And a lot of the cyber defense concerns don't necessarily, they're not top of mind day to day the way they would be for someone in your position. So we're coming up on the end of the year here. And so everybody's also going to be making their predictions or looking at 2025. Any outlook on the near future for you?
I think we're going to see more and more coverage of nations and their
Mm,
capabilities across specifically critical infrastructure. And what is China, Russia, Iran doing to politicians and our leadership? I think you're going to see more direct attacks on telecommunications companies. I think you're going to hear a little bit more about water, gas, sewage. And I think you're going to hear a lot more about specific espionage within the defense industrial base. To go back to the differences between a financial cyber attack and a military effectiveness attack is really, like I said, the incentives around the timelines. And so, like, if
Mm.
it's a financial one, you're trying to make money and it's money per month, money per year. And so
Mm-hmm.
you're incentivized when you compromise a system to just come out and say it and to try to get that money because it's effectively a business decision. Whereas the
Mm-hmm.
military effectiveness side of it, you're in many cases incentivized to kind of just wait and
Yeah.
provide these sleeper agent type concerns. And so I think there's going to be a growing number of unclassified discussions. And I think and hope that the US government talks about that more so that way businesses understand. And I don't know what the near term reaction is going to be, but I think at least having the discussion in the open is the right next step. To go back to myself, my entire adult life has been asking these questions of how do you produce a military system, a defense system, and oh, by the way, obviously it needs to be secure because you assume you're under constant attack.
Mm.
That's obviously not the way that all businesses think. And I think more and more they're going to wake up and realize that, oh my gosh, I for sure am a target because I didn't know this, but the parts I make are parts that are used on a submarine. I didn't even know that.
Mm-hmm.
Or the food I supply produces the food to the base nearby. Or the water I make supports this local hospital, which is, for whatever reason, of strategic importance.
And when you talk about constantly interrogating systems, it makes me think of some of the things that I've heard recently around security observability and logging all the things and the ways that people are starting to handle monitoring systems. Do you see those things also leveling up, or is there further technical innovation that needs to happen as far as the defense?
Absolutely. And for what it's worth on defensive side, I think defensive AI capabilities can certainly help. Because the issue
Mm.
with monitoring, logging, and alerting on everything is that you end up getting drowned out by the noise. And so when you actually are relying only on a person in the loop type approach, it ends up kind of getting treated more like spam or kind of ad hoc approach because of how much data they're now inundated with. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
they're almost waiting for an issue, to go back to the reactive versus proactive response. So I do think defensive AI systems, especially tied to monitoring, logging, and alerting, tremendous amount of gains that we're going to see for the next
Mm.
couple of years.
Well, that's good. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, this is just such a fraught topic, but it is also interesting. So I really appreciate you sharing your insights here today, Rob. It's always good to talk to you, and I hope things do improve.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not all doom and gloom. Obviously, believe people rally together and always find a way as a society. So certainly there'll be challenges ahead, but confident we'll figure them out together.
This has been IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions, comments, or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at B as in boy, P as in Peter, A-R, I, S as in Samuel, E-A-U at techtarget.com. Please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice. And tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about the challenges facing security operations. Thank you for being with us so far.